The air in the room was heavy, suffocating, a mixture of damp decay and something unnameable, something ancient. Victor's eyes, now dark voids reflecting no light, surveyed the room as if taking in the boundaries of his new reality. The faint sound of a clock ticking in the distance began to echo louder, a rhythm in tune with the shallow breathing that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "Victor," Clara whispered, her voice trembling but defiant, "this isn't you." Her words seemed to falter against the oppressive darkness as chains began rattling in the distance, the sound growing closer with each beat of the clock. "This body is mine," he growled, his voice a chorus of overlapping tones, human and inhuman. A sudden bang reverberated through the room as the door slammed shut of its own accord. The floor beneath Clara's feet creaked, an ominous groan that sent her heart racing. The knife lay at her feet, vibrating, its unearthly hum a counterpoint to the growing tension. As she bent to retrieve it, the distant cries of children pierced the air, followed by the unsettling chime of a distorted music box playing a fractured lullaby. "Do you think you can stop what's coming?" Victor's voice mocked her, the words seeming to come from every corner of the room. Clara tightened her grip on the knife, its vibrating blade emitting a low drone that harmonized with the ghostly whispers now circling her. "I'll stop you," Clara hissed, raising the blade. Thunder cracked, illuminating Victor for a split second. His face was no longer his. It was a shifting canvas of horrors, faces of the long dead, their mouths open in silent screams. The lightning flash was followed by the growling of wind and the eerie sound of unseen footsteps circling Clara. "Stop me?" Victor chuckled darkly, his voice blending with the rattling chains and the distant tolling of a church bell. "You're just like the others, a pawn in a game you can't comprehend." Suddenly, the ground beneath Clara seemed to shift, a low rumble accompanied by the creaking of ancient wood. She stumbled, catching herself on a table covered in dust and strange symbols carved deep into its surface. Blood began to drip from somewhere above, the soft patter adding to the cacophony of terror around her. Victor stepped forward, his movements unnatural, as if marionette strings pulled him. "The feast must continue," he murmured, reaching out a hand that seemed to ripple and distort like smoke. Clara screamed, her voice cutting through the noise as she plunged the knife forward. The blade connected, but instead of resistance, there was a sickening squelch, and Victor laughed, a guttural sound that reverberated through her chest. "You can't kill what's already dead," he whispered. The walls began to bleed, dark crimson trails running like tears as the sound of scraping metal grew louder, sharper. Clara backed away, but her foot caught on something, a skeletal hand reaching from beneath the floorboards. She fell, landing hard as a door creaked open behind her, revealing nothing but a void of black. Victor stood over her, his smile widening unnaturally. "This is only the beginning," he said as the knife in Clara's hand began to hum louder, its vibrations becoming almost unbearable. Then, with a sudden blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, everything went silent. The room was empty, save for Clara, now alone, clutching the knife. The door behind her slammed shut, and the faint sound of chains dragging echoed in the distance. She stood trembling, her reflection in the blade showing not her own face but Victor's, his grin still mocking her. The knife whispered to her, its voice low and insistent. "It's your turn now," it said. The story ends, but the feast begins anew. Who will be next? The knife's hum started again, a rhythmic vibration that seemed to resonate with the walls themselves, each beat louder than the last. Clara staggered backward, her breathing ragged and punctuated by the distant cries of children echoing from the void beyond the locked door. The air was dense, thick with static buzzing, as if an unseen current coursed through the room. From somewhere behind her, the unmistakable sound of a blade dragging across stone returned, louder this time, sharper. The scraping sent shivers down her spine, and she spun around to face the darkness. "Victor?" she called, her voice barely more than a whisper, swallowed by the low drone noise that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere all at once. A sudden bang shattered the uneasy stillness, and the sound of unseen footsteps approached, deliberate and slow. The reverberating footsteps stopped mere inches from her, and Clara froze, unable to turn, unable to move, as if something unseen held her in place. The creak of stairs came next, faint but growing louder, as if someone or something was descending into the room. Thunder cracked outside, illuminating the space once more, and in the flash of light she saw them. Faces, disembodied, floating just beyond the edges of the room's shadows. Their mouths moved in unison, but the only sound that followed was the haunting chime of bells and a low growl from deep within the void. Clara raised the knife instinctively, its edge now glowing faintly, casting a cold, pale light across the blood-streaked walls. "This ends here," she muttered, though the words rang hollow even to her. A faint laugh echoed from behind her, soft at first, then growing into a cacophony of ghostly laughter that filled the room. The laughter was joined by chains rattling and the hiss of wind slipping through unseen cracks. But then, a sudden silence fell. The oppressive quiet pressed against her ears, deafening in its absence of sound, save for the slow, deliberate sharpening of a blade coming from the shadows. The faint creak of floorboards signaled something, or someone, was moving closer. "Clara," a voice whispered, low and guttural, barely human, "you're too late." Her reflection in the knife's blade changed again, but it wasn't Victor this time. It was her own face, twisted into a grin far too wide, her eyes void of humanity. The image moved independently, speaking words she had not yet thought. "You've always been part of this," it hissed, just as a door slammed somewhere behind her. In that moment, the clock struck midnight, each chime resonating through the room with a thunderous echo. Victor, or what was left of him, stepped from the shadows, his form now grotesque, his features shifting between countless faces. "This isn't the end, Clara," he said, his voice layered with countless others. "This is your beginning." Before she could react, the knife in her hand began to pull away, twisting in her grip as if alive. Her reflection spoke again, this time with Victor's voice. "The feast requires more than just a host. It needs a willing participant." The blade turned in her hand, and with a final scream, the room went dark. In the silence that followed, a faint music box began to play, its haunting melody mingling with the distant sound of fire crackling. Outside, a wolf howled, and from the void, the scraping of metal started once more. The mortuary seemed alive with its own malignant intent. Clara gripped the knife, its vibration faint but constant, as if waiting for the right moment to unleash its dormant power. The room was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint sound of chains dragging somewhere deep within the shadows. Victor, or the thing wearing his body, stood motionless, his head tilted at an unnatural angle as if listening to voices only he could hear. "Do you feel it?" His voice was a grotesque mix of his own and something ancient, guttural and resonant. The words echoed unnaturally, bouncing off the walls as though the room itself hungered for sound. "The knife doesn't belong to you, Clara. It never did. It chooses who wields it." Clara steadied her breathing, ignoring the reverberating footsteps that seemed to circle her. "I'm not afraid of you," she spat, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Outside, thunder cracked, illuminating the decayed faces pressed against the mortuary's windows. Their eyeless sockets seemed to stare directly at her, and she turned away, gripping the knife tighter. Victor stepped closer, the floor creaking with each deliberate move. "Not afraid?" His lips twisted into a parody of a smile. "Then why are your hands trembling?" He reached out, his fingers impossibly long and clawed, brushing against the edge of the knife. The sound of metal scraping against bone filled the room, a nauseating symphony that made Clara's stomach churn. Suddenly, the knife's vibrations ceased. A low drone hummed in the air as if the mortuary itself was holding its breath. Clara lunged, the blade slicing through the darkness, but Victor caught her wrist mid-swing, his grip like iron. "You think this will save you?" he whispered, his face inches from hers. "This isn't a weapon, it's a key." Before she could react, the knife began to glow, casting a sickly green light that pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat. A sharp metallic clicking sound filled the air as the walls around them began to shift, the mortuary warping into something unrecognizable. Chains rattled overhead, and from the shadows, the decayed figures began to move, their grotesque grins widening.
Clara yanked her arm free and stumbled back, the knife still clutched in her hand. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice cracking as the figures closed in, their footsteps synchronized and deliberate.
Victor laughed, the sound echoing with a chilling resonance. "I'm not doing anything," he said. "You're the one who unlocked the door."
The floor beneath them splintered, and Clara screamed as she fell into darkness, the wind howling around her. She landed hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the mortuary. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the faint sound of children crying echoed in the distance.
Crying.
Victor stood above her, his form now fully monstrous.
His eyes burned with an unholy fire, and his body twisted and contorted as if it could barely contain the power surging within him. "Welcome to the feast," he said, his voice a cacophony of overlapping tones.
Clara scrambled to her feet, the knife her only solace.
"This isn't over," she said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her.
Victor smiled, his teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light.
"Now," he agreed, "it's just beginning."
From the shadows, a new figure emerged, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. It held a blade identical to Clara's, its edges dripping with an otherworldly ichor.
"2 keys," the figure said, its voice soft yet commanding. "Only 1 door."
The sound of a clock striking midnight filled the air, followed by the distant toll of a church bell. Clara tightened her grip on the knife, her resolve hardening. Whatever this was, she wouldn't go down without a fight. As the hooded figure stepped closer, the ground beneath them began to quake, and the air filled with the deafening cacophony of chains rattling, doors slamming, and glass shattering. The final twist came with a low, guttural growl that echoed from the void.
It wasn't Victor, or the hooded figure. It was something far older, far hungrier, waiting just beyond the edges of reality.
And it had just been awakened.